Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are taking a look at the human brain and all its fascinating complexities. More specifically, we're going to be focusing on what the science tells us about mental illness. You sent in this chapter from a neuroscience book, and wow, this stuff is dense.
It really is, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, like how do we even begin to define mental illness? There's so many different types, from learning disabilities to severe disorders.
Right, and this chapter actually tackles that head on. The term mental illness, it's a pretty broad category, right? Think about it. Down syndrome, which we know is linked to genetics, is classified as a mental illness.
Oh, wow.
But then you also have conditions like depression and anxiety and schizophrenia, and those things have such different causes and symptoms. It's amazing how much our understanding of mental illness has changed over time, too.
Yeah. It used to be all about, like, blaming spirits or bad parenting, right?
Exactly. But thankfully, we've moved past that. Now we know that mental illness is rooted in the brain itself, specifically in the communication between those brain cells.
So those neurotransmitters, like the chemical messengers, that stuff.
Exactly. Neurotransmitters carry vital information between neurons, and when those messages get messed up, it can lead to all sorts of problems. Think about it like a busy city.
Okay, yeah.
If the messengers in a city get their signals crossed, what happens? Total chaos.
Right, so much traffic.
Traffic jams, communication breakdowns. It's the same in the brain. When those neurotransmitter signals get mixed up, it can manifest as a mental health issue.
Okay, so how much of that mixed up signal thing is because of our genes? Is it nature or nurture? Or, some of both?
Well, this chapter actually pushes back against that kind of oversimplified view. It's not as simple as one gene, one disorder. Our genes definitely provide the blueprint, but the environment plays a huge role too. It's like a dimmer switch, controlling how much those genes actually express themselves.
So even the environment we're exposed to before we're born, like in the womb.
Absolutely. And the chapter gives some crazy examples of this. Fetal alcohol syndrome, for one, and the impact of the mother's stress during pregnancy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. But before we jump into that, let's take a look at some conditions that we know have a strong genetic link.
Okay.
The chapter covers a whole bunch of these, like Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, Rett syndrome, Williams syndrome, and autism.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
And each one of those disorders has a unique genetic basis that leads to specific cognitive and behavioral traits. So like, for example, Down syndrome arises from having an extra copy of chromosome 21.
Right.
And this leads to intellectual disabilities and some pretty distinctive physical characteristics.
So then Fragile X syndrome, that's caused by a mutation in a specific gene, right?
Yeah, you got it. It's a mutation in a gene called FMR1. And this mutation can lead to anxiety, learning challenges, and distinctive facial features. But here's the interesting part.
What's that?
The severity of those symptoms can be totally different from person to person, even within the same family.
So even with a clear genetic cause, there's still a lot of individual variation.
Exactly. Now, switching gears a bit, have you heard of Williams syndrome?
I have, yeah.
This one is caused by a deletion of a tiny piece of chromosome 7.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that people with Williams syndrome usually have exceptional musical abilities and strong language skills.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. But they also tend to have difficulty with things like spatial reasoning and math.
So it's not just about deficits, but about unique strengths, too.
Right. Now, what about autism? The chapter mentions it has a big genetic component, but that it's also really complex.
Yeah, autism is a tough one to pin down, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's got a really high heritability rate, but there isn't a single autism gene. It's more like a puzzle with a ton of pieces, each contributing a little bit to the overall picture.
Okay, so that actually brings up a question I've always wondered about. If genes are so powerful, why don't identical twins always both develop a condition like schizophrenia if one of them has it? I mean, they have the same DNA.
Right. It's a great question, and it's one that researchers are still trying to figure out. It just goes to show that genes don't act in isolation. There's this constant interplay between our genes and our environment, and that interaction can make a huge difference in whether or not a genetic predisposition actually turns into a disorder.
Okay, so that makes sense. So let's talk about those environmental factors. The chapter mentions some pretty heavy-hitting examples. Fetal alcohol syndrome, maternal stress during pregnancy, and PTSD.
Yeah, and fetal alcohol syndrome is a tragic reminder of just how powerful those environmental exposures during pregnancy can be.
Right.
Alcohol can pass right through the placenta and affect the fetus's developing brain.
Oh, wow.
And it can lead to a whole bunch of physical, cognitive, and behavioral issues later on.
And what about maternal stress? I never realized how much of an impact that could have on a developing baby.
It's crazy, isn't it? Basically, when a mother is stressed, her body releases stress hormones, and those hormones can cross the placenta and impact the baby's developing brain.
So it's like even before we're born, the environment is already interacting with our genes.
Exactly, and that interaction shapes the foundation of our mental health. Now, on to PTSD. It's triggered by witnessing or experiencing something traumatic, right?
Yeah.
And it can lead to this constant state of high alert with the body flooded with stress hormones even when the person is actually safe. It's almost like their fight or flight response is always switched on.
That sounds awful.
It is, and unfortunately, those physiological changes that happen because of PTSD can actually make a person more susceptible to other conditions like depression and anxiety. It's kind of a vicious cycle.
Okay, so we've covered genes, environment, and trauma. Let's switch gears and talk about depression, which is a condition that affects a ton of people.
Yeah.
The chapter mentions that it costs over $50 billion a year in the U.S. alone.
It's a huge public health issue, and it can manifest in so many different ways. You have people with a genetic predisposition to depression, others who develop it after a life-changing event, and still others who experience it chronically.
I always heard that depression is just a matter of low serotonin levels. Is that true?
Well, not quite. That's actually a pretty common misconception.
Oh, really?
Yeah. While serotonin definitely plays a role, it's not as straightforward as just having low levels. Many people with depression actually have normal serotonin levels.
Huh.
It's more about a delicate balance and signaling within the brain.
So if it's not just about the serotonin levels, how do those SSRI antidepressants even work? I thought they boosted serotonin.
Yeah, that is what they do.
Yeah.
But they're actually effective because they restore a more natural balance in the brain, not just because they flood it with serotonin.
Oh, I see.
It's about getting all those signals working together in sync.
Interesting. So besides medication, what other ways are there to treat depression? The chapter mentioned some pretty interesting alternative treatments.
Yeah, it does. One of those is ablation of a brain region called the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. It's an area that plays a role in emotional pain.
Wait, ablation, that sounds intense.
Yeah.
Like removing a part of the brain?
It is a very serious procedure, and it's only considered for really severe cases where nothing else works.
Okay. Are there any less invasive options?
There's deep brain stimulation. They implant a device that sends electrical impulses to specific areas of the brain to kind of reset its activity. And then there are those shock treatments like ECT and TMS.
Yeah, what about those shock treatments? What exactly are those and do they actually work?
Well, ECT stands for electroconvulsive therapy, and TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. Both have been around for a while now, and they actually have shown some promise in treating severe depression, especially when other treatments haven't been effective.
Wow.
With ECT, they pass electrical currents through the brain to induce a seizure.
A C.
Yeah, it's a very controlled seizure, and the idea is that it resets the brain's activity. TMS is a bit less intense. It uses magnetic pulses to stimulate those specific brain areas.
Okay.
It's like giving the brain a little jump start.
Interesting. And what about the memory loss? I heard ECT can cause memory loss.
Yeah, you're right. Memory loss is a potential side effect of ECT, although usually it's temporary and limited to the time around the treatment. But it's interesting because the chapter actually suggests that negative memories themselves might play a role in keeping depression going, like a feedback loop, you know?
So it's about breaking that loop, whether it's with medication, therapy, or these alternative treatments. But what about schizophrenia? That's completely different, right? The chapter describes it as being disconnected from reality.
Right. Schizophrenia is characterized by a really profound break from reality, and it often involves two types of symptoms. Positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, and negative symptoms, which are more about the loss of normal functions.
So hallucinations are considered a positive symptom.
That's interesting. And the chapter mentions these brain imaging studies that show activity in the auditory cortex of people experiencing hallucinations even when there's no actual sound.
That's right. It's almost like their brains are creating those perceptions internally.
Wow.
And those negative symptoms, those are often overlooked, but they can be just as debilitating.
You mentioned earlier that negative symptoms are harder to treat, is that right?
They are. While antipsychotic meds have been great for managing those positive symptoms, like the hallucinations, they haven't been as successful in addressing those negative symptoms.
Interesting. And remember how we talked about that 50% concordance rate in identical twins for schizophrenia?
Yeah.
So if genetics play such a big role, what's happening in that other 50%? Is there some mysterious environmental trigger that we haven't discovered yet?
Yeah, it's a huge question mark. Researchers are still trying to piece together that puzzle, figuring out how those environmental factors interact with our genes to trigger the onset of schizophrenia. It's like we have half the map, but we're still looking for the other half.
Exactly.
This is all so fascinating, and we're just getting started.
I know. There's still so much more to uncover.
Well, we'll have to pause here for now, but we'll pick up right where we left off in part 2.
I can't wait.
So stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into all things brain-related.
We're back, and our brains are already full.
I know, right?
So much fascinating stuff in that last part.
It's crazy how much we're learning about the brain all the time.
Yeah. And this chapter doesn't just explain mental illness, it also talks about how we're actually tackling those challenges.
Exactly. And while there's no one-size-fits-all solution, we've definitely come a long way.
For sure. Like, medications have been huge game changers for so many people.
Totally. But this chapter makes it clear that medication isn't a magic bullet.
Right.
I mean, they can have side effects, and they don't always address those underlying causes of mental illness.
Yeah, it's kind of like taking painkillers for a broken leg, right? It helps with the pain, but it doesn't actually fix the problem.
Exactly. Ideally, we need to understand exactly what's going on in each individual's brain and then tailor the treatment based on that.
That makes a lot of sense. So, speaking of tailoring treatments, the chapter talks about some pretty cutting-edge stuff that goes beyond just the usual therapy and medication.
Right. One of the things that caught my eye was transcranial magnetic stimulation,
Yeah.
TMS. We talked about it briefly before as a treatment for depression.
Yeah, using those magnetic pulses to stimulate certain brain areas. It's like a brain tune-up without actually having to do surgery.
Pretty cool, right? And now they're actually exploring TMS for other things too, not just depression.
Oh, wow. Like what?
Anxiety disorders, PTSD, even schizophrenia.
So instead of taking this broad approach, we're getting much more precise with our treatments.
Exactly. And there's another cool technique that they mention, neurofeedback. Have you heard of that?
I have, but I don't really know how it works.
So basically, with neurofeedback, you learn to control your own brainwaves in real time.
Oh, how does that work?
You wear this cap with sensors, and the sensors pick up on your brainwave patterns.
Okay.
And then those patterns are displayed on a screen. And through some exercises and feedback, you can learn to change those patterns.
So it's like biofeedback, but for your brain.
Exactly. It's training your brain to work better. And they've actually had some pretty good results using neurofeedback for things like stress reduction, improving focus, and even managing ADHD and anxiety.
That's amazing. It's like rewiring your brain by paying attention to what it's doing.
Right. And when we're talking about the future of mental health, we can't ignore the elephant in the room.
What's that?
Artificial intelligence.
Ah, AI. Everyone's talking about it. But what does it even mean for mental health?
It's changing everything, really. One thing that's really promising is using AI for early detection and diagnosis. Imagine algorithms that can analyze a person's speech patterns, facial expressions, even their social media activity to pick up on early signs of mental health issues.
Wow, that's kind of Big Brother-ish, isn't it?
It does sound a bit like that, I know.
Are there any privacy issues with that?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a really important thing to consider. Any AI applications in mental health need to be developed and used really carefully and ethically,
Right.
but the potential benefits are huge.
Yeah, like what?
Well, imagine being able to identify people who are at risk for developing mental health issues before those problems even become serious. That would be game-changing.
It's like preventive mental health care.
Exactly. And that brings us to this idea of a more holistic approach to mental health. You know, this chapter really emphasizes the mind-body connection.
Right. It's not all in our heads.
Exactly. Sometimes it's about getting back to those basic things that are good for us, you know?
Like what?
Things like sleep, exercise, nutrition, those basic building blocks of well-being that so many of us neglect.
So all that stuff our parents have been nagging us about forever.
Pretty much. Turns out they were onto something. There's a lot of research showing that those lifestyle factors have a massive impact on our mental health. Like eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, those things can actually reduce the risk of depression.
I guess Mom was right.
And managing stress is super important too.
So it's not just about fixing the brain. It's about creating an environment where the brain can thrive.
Right. We need to support mental well-being from all angles.
It's kind of like a garden, right? You need good soil, water, sunlight,
Hmm.
All of that for your plants to grow.
Exactly. And it all goes back to that complex interplay between genes and environment. This chapter keeps reminding us that our genes aren't destiny.
Right, we talked about that earlier, how the environment's like a dimmer switch for our genes. Even if we inherit genes that make us more vulnerable to certain conditions, our experiences can make a difference.
Absolutely. And that understanding has actually led to this whole new area of research called epigenetics.
Epigenetics, what's that?
It's basically the study of how environmental factors can change the way our genes express themselves.
I don't get it.
Okay, so think of it like this. Our experiences can actually leave little chemical tags on our DNA.
Oh, wow.
And those tags can influence how our genes are read and used by the body.
So it's like our genes aren't this fixed blueprint. They can change based on what we experience.
You got it. And this opens up a whole world of possibilities for interventions and prevention. Imagine if we could identify these epigenetic changes early on and figure out how to reverse them.
That would be incredible. So it's like we have some control over how our genes express themselves.
Exactly. And this leads to another really important point that the chapter brings up, the need to fight against the stigma surrounding mental illness.
Oh, yeah, it's sad that there's still so much shame around mental health issues.
Right. People are afraid to talk about it, to seek help because they worry about what others will think.
It's like it's seen as a weakness or a character flaw.
Yeah, and that stigma prevents people from getting the help they need. And it just makes things worse.
It's like we need to normalize talking about mental health.
Exactly. We need to be more open and understanding and create a culture where it's okay to be vulnerable.
So it's like instead of shutting people out who are struggling,
Yeah.
we need to create a space where they feel safe talking about it and getting support.
Exactly. And that shift needs to happen on a societal level. We all have a responsibility to challenge those negative stereotypes and advocate for policies that make it easier for people to access mental health care.
It's about creating a world where mental well-being is valued just as much as physical health.
Absolutely. And that leads right back to this idea of early intervention, which is a huge theme in this chapter.
Yeah, I get that. The earlier we address these challenges, the better, right? It's like putting out a fire before it gets out of control.
Perfect analogy. And it's not just about preventing bad things from happening, it's also about promoting good mental health, helping people build resilience so they can cope with the inevitable ups and downs of life.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. We need to address the problems, but also cultivate well-being.
Exactly. And that requires looking at the whole person, not just their symptoms. We need to consider their biology, their psychology, their social environment, all of it.
It's about recognizing how complex and interconnected all these factors are.
Right. But with so many different mental illnesses out there, each with their own causes and symptoms, is there anything that connects them all? Any common thread?
That's a good question.
This chapter really emphasizes that mental illness exists on a spectrum. It's not these clear-cut categories. There's a lot of overlap. Symptoms can be different for everyone, and there's no single cure that works for everyone.
So it's more about understanding each person's unique experience than trying to fit them into a specific category.
Exactly. And that means we need to change how we approach mental health care too.
In what way?
We need to move away from this idea of one size fits all and embrace a more personalized approach that takes each person's individual needs and circumstances into account.
So it's like a puzzle, right? Each piece is unique, and we need to look at how it all fits together.
You got it. And speaking of puzzles, let's talk about one of the biggest mysteries of all, consciousness.
Ah, yes, the big one. What is consciousness, and where does it come from? It seems like we know so much about the brain now, but consciousness is still kind of a mystery.
I know. It's like we can map out all the different parts of the brain, but we still can't fully explain that feeling of awareness, you know?
Right, it's like we can describe the hardware of a computer, but we don't really understand the software that makes it all work.
That's a great way to put it. This chapter doesn't get too deep into the philosophy of consciousness, but it does acknowledge how mysterious it really is. And it talks about these altered states of consciousness, like the kind you might experience with psychoactive substances.
Right, like ayahuasca, that brew they use in some spiritual traditions. I've heard it can induce some pretty intense altered states.
It can. And those experiences, while they're subjective and hard to study scientifically, they really make you question the nature of reality. It's like getting a glimpse into another dimension.
It makes you wonder if those altered states are just hallucinations, or if they're revealing something fundamental about consciousness itself.
Exactly. It's a question that continues to fascinate scientists and philosophers alike. And as we keep learning more about the brain, maybe we'll get closer to understanding consciousness too. But for now, That's one for the mystery files.
Well, I guess some mysteries are meant to be pondered.
Definitely.
Well, that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive. But don't worry, there's still more to come. We'll be back in part 3 to talk about the latest research, the ethics of mental health care, and what the future might hold for this fascinating and ever-evolving field. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've covered so much ground already exploring the brain and all its fascinating quirks.
It's been quite a journey, but even after all this, I think the biggest takeaway is that our understanding of the brain and mental health is constantly evolving.
It's like we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. There are still so many mysteries to solve. But the research is moving so fast, and we're seeing this incredible shift in how we think about and approach mental well-being.
Speaking of those shifts, the chapter touches on this idea of personalized medicine, which seems like it could be a real game changer for mental health care.
Absolutely. Personalized medicine is all about tailoring treatment to the individual's specific needs, moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach.
So no more just prescribing the same medication or therapy to everyone with a certain diagnosis. We're moving towards a more individualized approach, right?
Right. Taking into account things like a person's genes, their lifestyle, their preferences. It's like designing a custom-tailored treatment plan.
That's a great way to put it. And this is all driven by advances in things like genomics, data analytics, and of course, AI.
Exactly. Imagine being able to analyze a person's genetic profile and figure out which medications are most likely to work for them and which ones might cause side effects.
It's like having a personalized roadmap for navigating your mental health care. You mentioned AI earlier. Are there any AI applications in mental health that you're particularly excited about?
Oh, definitely. Besides personalized treatment plans, AI can also be used to develop things like virtual therapists.
Wait, virtual therapists? Like, we'll be talking to AI bots instead of human therapists.
Well, maybe not completely replacing human therapists, but AI could definitely augment those interactions, and it could make mental health support available 24/7.
I'm not sure how I feel about that. It's cool, but also kind of strange.
Yeah, it's understandable to have mixed feelings. It's crucial that we use AI ethically and responsibly. It should be a tool to enhance human connection, not replace it.
That makes sense. So it's not about
Right.
replacing therapists, but about expanding access to care and making it more convenient. And telehealth has been a huge part of that too, right?
Absolutely. Especially since the pandemic, telehealth has allowed people to access mental health services remotely, which has been a game changer for a lot of folks.
Especially those in rural areas or those who have a hard time getting to in-person appointments. And then there are all those mental health apps too.
Right. There's an app for everything these days. Tracking your mood, managing stress, practicing mindfulness.
It's empowering, in a way, having all these tools at your fingertips. But it's important to remember that apps aren't a replacement for actual professional help, right?
Exactly. They can be a good supplement, like a mental health first aid kit. But for serious issues, it's still crucial to seek help from a qualified professional.
Okay, so as we look to the future of mental health care, what are some of the big challenges we still need to address?
Well, there's still a lot of work to do in terms of reducing the stigma surrounding mental illness.
Yeah, that stigma is a huge barrier for people seeking help.
It really is.
Right.
We also need to address those disparities in access to care. Not everyone has equal access to mental health services. And of course, we need to keep developing better treatments, especially for conditions that haven't responded well to current approaches.
Those are all important points.
Yeah.
But there's also reason to be optimistic, right? We're making so much progress in terms of our understanding of the brain, and we have all these new tools and technologies emerging.
I'm definitely optimistic. I think we're at a really exciting turning point in mental health care. There's so much potential for growth and discovery.
I agree. And on that note of hope and possibility, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the brain and mental illness.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope this has given you some new insights and maybe even sparked your curiosity to learn more. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about mental health, the better equipped we are to support ourselves and each other. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep taking care of your own mental well-being. Until next time.